A Sunlit Absence, Chapter 3, The Open Porches of the Mind, on Silence and Noise. The result of justice will be silence and trust forever. Isaiah 32:17. Let stillness be the criterion for assessing everything. Evagrius. If you love truth, love silence. Isaac the Syrian. The Blackbird Singing. With hopes of teaching them all how to draw, Kathleen Norris stands before her classroom of elementary school students. She recounts in Amazing Grace her remarkable way of going about this. Before teaching them to draw, she first needs to teach them how to be silent and aware. She explains to the class that when she raises her hand, they are to make as much noise as they possibly can, but when she lowers her hand, they must all be completely silent. No noise, no movement, no making funny faces. The lesson begins. She raises her hand and an almighty racket ensues. But as soon as she drops her hand, the noise indeed stops instantly. They were so still, she says, that silence became a presence in the classroom. What fascinates Norris most is how the silence liberated the imagination of so many children. Her simple exercise with these school children shows us something important about the nature of silence. Silence is not simply about the absence of sound waves. It is concerned with attention and awareness. Silence and awareness are in fact one thing. Poets seem to know about this unity of silence and awareness. Wallace Stevens shows this in his 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. I do not know which to prefer, the beauty of inflections or the beauty of innuendos, the blackbird whistling or just after. The song of the blackbird evokes the same attentive wonder as when the blackbird stops singing. Robert Penn Warren likewise perceives the porous union of sound and silence in his famous poem, The Enclave. Out of the silence the saying, into the silence the said. Thus, silence in timelessness gives forth time and receives it again, and I lie in darkness and hear the wind off the sea heave. As vital as physical silence is for opening up the depth of the present moment, silence does much more than simply tiptoe around. Its essence has little to do with the absence of sound waves, for silence has no opposite. Its embrace is wide and generous enough to receive all, both sound and the absence of sound. The practice of contemplation gradually reveals the silent presence flowing through the mud and reeds and rushes of both noise and sound. Without doubt, regular periods of physical silence play a crucial role in the spiritual life. It must be cultivated and reverenced. We don't make retreats alongside highways. Places of retreat, centers of recovery and healing, even some religious communities purposefully cultivate physical silence in service of something else. Stretches of physical silence and contemplation, especially on a daily basis, help de-stress the nervous system. While the constant stimulation of the noise of everyday life keeps anxiety levels high and our attention fixed on objects that we are, more or less, aware of, whether an exterior object such as a computer screen or an interior object such as a thought or feeling or mind-tripping inner video. But God is not an object in the way these things are objects, and therefore cannot be an object of our awareness in the same way. This is one of the implications of what theology calls the divine simplicity. All creation emerges from and points to, at one and the same time, this simple, grounding source that is not a particular thing in the way creatures are. An environment of physical simplicity and silence helps relax the tight grip of our mind's reactive preoccupation with objects in order that deeper ways of encountering God, which we all have within us, may emerge and open and receive that light that constantly gives and sustains all that is. Some varieties of silence. Not all silence is the same. There is the awkward silence of the road trip with someone we do not know quite well enough to be silent next to. The refrigerating silence of hardened anger, the reverential silence of dogwoods in winter, the vast silence of a cathedral, the focused silence of absorption in our sewing or a good book, the stunned silence of seeing the status of our pension fund. Each features physical silence, the absence of sound waves, but this silence is merely the outer form of other dynamics. In the spiritual life, silence is characterized by a powerfully searching and subtle dynamic. If we know how to dwell in physical silence, then silence becomes not a threat, but attractive, nurturing, and liberating. The powerful attraction of something as utterly simple as silence is well attested throughout the contemplative tradition. The following is a good example of how silence is not simply concerned with a buttoned lip or a cold shoulder. The 14th century Augustinian friar and spiritual writer Jordan of Saxony not only shaped the spirituality of his own religious community, but also stood on the shoulders of countless saints and sages who have witnessed to what silence does other than make no noise. He presumes that any community that seeks God together is going to have places where, quote, silence should be observed. From this silence, peace of mind is born, advance in studies is promoted, devout contemplation takes its beginnings. Furthermore, according to the words of the prophet, the cultivation of justice is silence. Isaiah 32:17. Through silence, a brother begins to cultivate and practice justice, by which virtue he is formed so as to live his own life honestly, not to harm others, and to give each one his due. Such formation as this carries anyone so formed on to the state of perfection. On the other hand, from the breakdown of silence, disturbances of mind arise, quarrels are born, strife. Unquote. Notice all the things silence does other than be quiet. Silence is real enough to be afraid of, but when integrated into an environment and a way of living, it calms and gradually integrates us into it. Jordan of Saxony sees the generative power of silence. Its children are peace of mind and the cultivation of justice. This peace is not the opposite of turmoil, but the ground of both turmoil and tranquility. Moreover, silence is formative and developmental. It leads us to perfection. That is to say, it draws us to completion or wholeness. The breakdown of silence, environmental, generative, or developmental, has dire consequences, an increase in anxiety and quarrels, which fuels the sense of alienation from ourselves, from God, and from those with whom we live. Like many spiritual masters before and after him, Jordan of Saxony knows the cost of the loss of silence in one's living environment and in one's prayer life. The 20th century Swiss psychoanalyst C.G. Jung apparently knew this, and today medicine has discovered the practice of contemplation to be an effective de-stressor, with direct bearing on weight control, blood pressure, and much more. There is told a story of how Jung used silence to help one of his patients become aware of the cause of his problems. Complaining of a general anxiety, but unable to identify what he was anxious about, the client did not give Jung much to work with. Jung suggested he go home and spend the evenings alone and see what came up before their next appointment the following week. The man returned and told Jung that he had enjoyed the evenings alone at home. He had read a novel he had been meaning to read for months and listened to symphonies he had not enjoyed for years. Jung said, I didn't mean to go home and read or listen to music just now. I meant to go home during the evenings and just be silent. And so the man went home and did just that. When he returned the following week, he had plenty that he could begin to talk about. The silence had begun to draw out some of the problems that underlay this man's anxiety so that he could now begin to address them. Silence is sometimes like a poultice placed over a sore to draw out infection as part of the healing process. The silence of the electric saw. It is one thing to see the unity of silence and sound when our teachers are birdsong and the seas breaking waves. But what might Wallace Stevens or Robert Penn Warren say about unpleasant noise? Can noise also be a vehicle of that peace after perfect speech? Does the sound we would prefer not to hear have anything to reveal? Can noise, too, be a teacher pointing to the silence that is the ground of all? Is noise also, like everything else that exists, a spoke leading to the hub that is the center of us all? The measure of our ability to live in silence is our reaction to noise, whether external or internal, and not the length of time we go without hearing anything or hearing only what we like to hear. As contemplative practice matures, we begin to relate to disruptive noise differently. We learn to meet sound that displeases with the same stillness with which we meet the sounds that please us, as the following account reveals. Gareth had been drawn and dedicated to the practice of contemplation over many years. He heard about a week-long retreat on contemplative prayer and thought this would be a good way to deepen his prayer life. The small retreat house was situated in a mountain village that overlooked a valley. The silence that pervaded the whole place was indescribable, and he settled easily into the spirit of the retreat along with the other retreatants. They all sat together in silent prayer for a total of about 7 hours spread throughout the course of the day. They combined this with manual work as well as some free time for napping or walks in nature. The retreat ended up being a pivotal breakthrough for him, not because of the prayerful silence and beauty of the mountains, but because of the outrageously annoying buzz of an electric saw. For about an hour in the afternoon, over 3 consecutive days, the neighbor next door to the retreat house would saw timber with his electric table saw. Gareth thought his fillings were going to vibrate out of his back teeth, and he seriously considered either skipping that period of prayer or simply returning home. He could just not believe that this sort of disruption was happening during his retreat. The retreat guide advised him to just stick with it and to use the ordeal as an experiment in cultivating inner stillness in the midst of irritating noise. Apart from this hour, there was virtually complete absence of irritating noise. To the retreat guide's amazement, Gareth decided to try to adopt a mature attitude and follow this advice. He ended up discovering something important about silence. Coping with disruptive noise that we simply cannot do anything about does not so much call for praying to the patron saint of noise reduction as for being resolved that it's okay for the noise to be there if it happens to be there and nothing can be done about it. To get caught up in a buzzing commentary on how irritating the noise is makes for a noisy relationship with noise. The irritation is something the mind adds. We need a simpler relationship with noise. Instead of meeting an irritating buzzsaw, we just want to let the buzzsaw be there if nothing can be done about it. For this to happen, 2 things are required. First, if our practice has been deeply established, we are in a position to learn something from silence and its generous way of allowing noise to be present when it happens to be present. To get caught up in commentary on the noise will not make it go away, but will only tighten the clenching of our jaws around our preference that the noise be gone. In our own generous release into our practice mirrors what silence does all the time. Silence is wide and gracious enough to allow sound, even irritating sound, to be present. Second, instead of trying to push the disruption away, we shift our attention away from the disrupting noise to our prayer word or to whatever our contemplative practice is. The return is not a pushing away or a reactive clinging, but a generous release into our practice. We will soon begin to see that the noisy disruption that we cannot control becomes an exercise, a training that strengthens us in our practice, the way a challenging terrain strengthens the distance runner. But again, this return to our practice will not be a pushing away or a flight from the disruption. Deepening immersion in contemplative practice is simultaneous with allowing the disruption to be present. We just become better at not letting it steal our attention. And when it inevitably does, we simply bring the attention home without comment. This is what Gareth needed to learn. He preferred to have no disturbance. But through a gift of insight, he saw that the silence was actually receiving the sound of the saw, and he released himself into his practice instead of reacting to the irritating noise. He let the sound be simply because it was. He could soon see that the sound of the saw was simply the sound of the saw. The sense of irritation was supplied by mental commentary. Gareth's inability to cope with the sound of the electric saw disrupting a contemplative prayer retreat resulted from his spasms of preference for only sounds that pleased him, such as birdsong, the rustling of leaves, or rain. Apart from his inner contortions during this 1 hour of outrageous disruption, there was nothing else going on just then except a saw making the sound saws make when they're switched on and sawing through timber. The more he allowed the noise to be present without fighting the fact that it was there, the more he could simply sit in the midst of it. He would have preferred, and with good reason, that the noise not be there, and ideally it should not have been. But he was amazed that, after this deepened release into his practice, his mind no longer hopped around like drops of oil on a hot skillet. Gareth's breakthrough came when he was sitting there during a period of silent prayer as the electric saw squealed. He said later to the retreat guide, "I do not know how to put this into words. My commenting mind simply fell away. There was only the sound of the saw, but there was no commenting mind listening to it. There was only the sound of a saw. Now that this is in the past and I reflect upon it, it sounds silly. But I know that when the mind is still, sound is as silent as no sound." Gareth's experience was a real grace, but should not be considered exceptional to the dynamics of inner silencing. St. Isaac the Syrian says, "Love silence above all things, because it brings you near to the fruit that the tongue cannot express." He encourages us to practice silence diligently. Then, from out of this silence, something is born that leads to silence itself. Meister Eckhart says, "The noblest attainment in this life is to be silent." By silent, does this 14th century Dominican friar simply mean physical silence? He means far more than this and calls it being in the right state of mind. Eckhart illustrates this in a provocative way in an address to young people who are training to be fellow members of his Dominican order. In characteristic fashion, Eckhart shocks his audience a bit. He says, "I was once asked, some people like to withdraw from company and prefer to be alone. That is where they find peace. Is this the best thing?" My answer was no. Why would Eckhart say no? He is fully aware that physical silence is the preferred environment for prayer and that it needs to be valued and cultivated. But deep prayer is not about a physically silent environment, but about the loving communion that is silence itself. And silence itself is deeper than the presence or absence of sound waves. A silent environment is the opposite of a noisy environment, but the silence Eckhart wants to lead these students to has no opposite. It grounds all that appears and disappears in awareness, all that comes and goes. Eckhart is trying to nudge his audience toward this discovery. The realization of this silence that has no opposite is what he calls being in the right state of mind. This right state of mind is a silent mind and is always present within us. Therefore, Eckhart says, if he is in the right state of mind, he is so whether he is in church or the marketplace. Gareth made good use of that disrupting noise had to teach him. Not all the retreatants had the same breakthrough Gareth had. On the second to last day of the retreat, as soon as the neighbor's table saw began its daily squeal, one man got up from his place in the oratory, stormed out of the retreat center, and rampaged over to the neighbor's garage. He then yanked the saw's electric cord out of its socket, overturned the neighbor's table saw, and shouted at a volume all could hear, "What in the name of God do you think you're doing sawing wood when all these people have paid good money to have a week's peace and quiet?" A brief interchange between the two men ensued. The level of language was not especially elevated, but the saw ceased its daily hour of buzzing squeal, and for what was left of the retreat, the only sound was bird song, the mooing of distant cattle, rainfall, and the sound of a gentle breeze. We each make our way on the pathless path of contemplation along different trails, each trail thick with tangled vines of providence. A wheel full of spokes. Indeed, silence does more than tiptoe around the house. Silence moves through all sound like water through netting. The deeper our own interior silence, the more we take on its gracious way of opening up the tight mind that clenches its teeth around what it wants and spits out what it doesn't want. The optimal environment for prayer is physical silence. St. Augustine, surely one of the most eloquent people in history, thought it was better to keep silent than to speak, and that one should speak only if it is duly demanded by one's office. He continues, "What do you want to speak and not? Why do you want to speak and not want to listen? You are always rushing out of doors, but are unwilling to return into your own house. Your teacher is within." Physical silence is good for us and needs to be pursued, cultivated, understood, and revered. Physical silence increases our awareness of all that is going on around us, especially the needs and sensitivities of others. Louis de Leon, O.S.A., the 16th century Spanish Augustinian friar and lyric poet, extols the value of physical silence in his poem, The Quiet Life. How peaceful is the life, he says, of him who would all worldly clamor shun, and take the hidden path, wherein have walked alone those few wise men the world has ever known. But not too far down the spiritual path, we learn that there is a deeper silence that does not require sound waves to be gone. For the mind that is silent, noise is as direct a spoke into the hub of silence as are bird song, wind, and waves. It requires nothing more than to meet noise with stillness and not commentary. This is easier said than done, and comes after many seasons of practice and much failure. But whether the noise in question is an electric table saw, rush hour traffic, heavy-footed neighbors in the apartment above us, difficult life circumstances at home or work, or, more deafening, the mind-numbing dim of the cocktail party in our heads, the way of silence receives with engaged awareness all that is, just as it is, as a large screened-in porch receives whatever breeze that blows. R.S. Thomas prays that silence may work on us, quote, "so those closed porches be opened once more for the better ventilating of the atmosphere of the closed mind," unquote. Silence circulates through the open porches of the mind, but to the mind unventilated by silence, there's only what we like and what we dislike coming at us from all sides, day after day, indeed, decade after decade. Life has a way of being exactly the way it happens to be at any given moment. Life being how it is, just this, is a wheel of spokes leading to the hub of silence, irrespective of the presence or absence of pleasant or unpleasant sound. Surely we have our preference as to sound or absence of sound, but silence resounds in all sound, pleasant or unpleasant. This silence resounding in all sound ventilates the porches of the mind and makes the ears of attention attend. Discovering the silence that resounds in all sound, even in noise, places in us what Meister Eckhart calls the right state of mind. Whether we are in country quiet or market mayhem, this strengthens our practice of contemplation.